Hello all, and welcome to today's session on the value of a treasurer to today's finance organisation in association with Kyriba. I'm Emily Helps, Deputy Treasurer for Evershort Rail, AMCT, and Chair of the ACT's Future Leaders in Treasury Group. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Bob Stark, Global Head of Market Strategy at Kyriba, who during the next 40 minutes will be talking about this topic, looking at it under three different angles. So those three angles will be, first off, what's the role of the treasurer post-pandemic? Then we'll move on to how can the treasurer provide value, to finally close on how do we measure the impact on the organization. We'd like the session to be as interactive as possible. So if you'd like to, please post your questions in the Q&A toolbar at the right-hand side of your screen in the About and Participate section, and we'll try to pick up the questions as we go along. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Bob.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'll apologize. When I look down my phone, my ability to click slides is based on my phone. So I'm very focused on all of you to tell you this great session, but sometimes I'll have to look down, and it's not because I'm not paying attention. Now, as I click, there's my example of looking down, Emily. Let's talk about post-pandemic treasurer and get right into it. So when we say post-pandemic, I know that's an optimistic view. Many of us are thinking post-pandemic, okay, we're not quite there yet. And that's true. But thinking a little bit ahead in terms of what does treasury look like towards the end of this year into next year, there's a couple of interesting themes that I've put on this slide. I'm going to start from the left and work my way over to the right. For starters, what we've seen, a variety of different surveys, is that the majority of CFOs expect some element of remote work. Now, that is pretty much like almost normal in that we have remote work right now. We're all at home, just like we are today, presenting. And you think from a treasury standpoint, okay, it's just a little bit of status quo. There's not anything that's tremendously different. But what we find is many organizations, especially on the treasury side, it's almost like we had to flip that switch a year and a bit ago. And flipping that switch means that it's not like we were prepared for permanent work from home or elements of that. It was that we just made do with what we had last March and April. We finally normalized last May, and then fast forward 12 months and we feel like we have a good handle on how to get visibility, controls, how to approve payments, all those different functions that we typically manage in treasury. But the interesting part is that on a permanent basis, and we said almost 2/3 of CFOs are expecting that, there is an opportunity for improved controls. These controls have to be more resilient. So if you think of just a typical workflow like payments, and that's a great example, you have to consider that what does that look like in a semi-permanent state? What does that look like if we are working from home 1 day a week or 2 days a week as opposed to 5 days a week like we are right now? How does it differ on Wednesday when we may be in the office, but Thursday when we're not? And so as a result, as we're thinking post-pandemic, we need to really be conscious of what are those manual controls going to look like and what level of automation do we need? And how do we ensure, and this is the key part, consistency between in the office and out of the office? Because if you think right now, I assume most of us are out of the office. So the consistency is day to day. But if you're in the office part of the week and out of the office part of the week, that's where there's potential opportunities for inconsistency or not having standardized ways of doing those processes. So as a result, it's very important to just recognize we need to prepare for what this looks like and when we are and aren't in the office. I think it's pretty obvious to most, but just to really, it's the consistency that I think most people are not expecting. Now, that said, let's talk about the process. If you look at the middle bar, 78% of the CFOs suggested, and this I think is consistent with all of your experience, that we had some inefficiencies. There were some challenges. We just weren't ready for remote work and everything that happened. That said, all the best practices that were put in place, so whether it's on cash management, on forecasting, on collaborating with other individuals to manage, say, early payment, supplier payment programs, those sorts of things, almost all of Treasury teams suggested that there is a interest in retaining those. So if you think of all the good things that you've done during the pandemic from a Treasury standpoint, chances are pretty good you're going to retain those improvements, whether they be digitization, automation, improved collaboration, all of those things will be likely the same. Again, probably very obvious to most of you. The third part, though, is where we get to a little bit interesting use of technology. This push that we had towards digitization, pretty normal, and we expected all that. We had to find the manual processes and change those around so that we actually had more digitization. We had things that were more automated, less paper, less manual, more productivity and efficiency. What is going to be interesting going forward is the fact that we have new technologies that are really starting to become more popularized in Treasury. So you look at things like artificial intelligence, business intelligence, even just APIs that have this element of real-time connectivity and real-time Treasury associated with them. Those are all examples of the next level of decision-making within Treasury. We need to be conscious of that because they present interesting and amazing opportunities. So we can talk more about that in questions if you have those, but I'm going to move on to the next slide and just talk about CFO objectives. Now you think, why would I care about those? Well, it's because we report to the CFO in Treasury. So a typical CFO objective becomes a typical Treasury objective in most cases. What we're finding, and I put a slide like this, it's very vague in general, but the point is that if you look at these as a typical roadmap of what CFO is responsible for, if you kind of look at where Treasury is and say, okay, growth, yeah, we're sort of responsible. Maybe cash flow is maybe the element that we're responsible for, but maybe not as much top line revenue. That's not really a Treasury responsibility. Or if you look at efficiency and you think of some of those calculations or KPIs and you think, oh, I guess we're a little bit a part of that. The interesting part is that Treasury's involvement across the board is increasing. And a lot of that was stimulated by what we saw about a year, maybe a little bit more than that ago, where suddenly Treasury is vaulted into the spotlight to answer key questions about liquidity or cash, or how much money do we have to pay our invoices, making those decisions where you had listed invoices and deciding what gets paid today versus what doesn't. If you remember that from a year and a bit ago, it's very similar to what we saw in 2008, 2009. And what we typically see is that Treasury has earned that seat at the table if you did a fantastic job, which I'm sure you did. And that's where your objectives tend to start to become a little closer to some of these. So we see a lot of treasurers that now have objectives that align to top line or bottom line impact, as an example, under the growth area. So I won't go through all of these, just to identify the fact that there's this movement towards becoming more strategic and more involved in business decisions rather than just operational cash management. Now, the culmination of this section in terms of post-pandemic Treasury, before we get into the fun stuff, is that the typical responsibilities you see here in green. So Treasury being responsible for cash, liquidity management, payments, bank relationships, risk management, it's pretty normal. We see that and we expect that. But these areas on the right, compliance and controls, working capital, cash conversion cycles, being responsible for days payable outstanding or days sales or receivables outstanding, those are levers that are relatively new to most Treasury teams. And certainly this idea of being a business partner is relatively new as well. So what we're seeing is that treasurers are starting to gain responsibilities across all of these areas in addition to what they're responsible before. So I'll pause on that point, Emily, because there may be some questions around that. But the interesting point here is that the Treasury's remit has grown and will continue to do so. And it's a great opportunity for Treasury teams to demonstrate, to show their value.
Thanks, Rob. As Rob just said, we'll try and pause for a few minutes to see if any of you have any questions. So just give people a couple of minutes.
Yeah, of course. And then while those may come in, I think there's so many different examples. I was going to say, there's a lot of different examples of what that could look like. Typically, what we see for, say, being a business partner is looking at the fundamentals of what Treasury does well. So let's say cash and liquidity management. An example of what that does well is not just identifying here's our excess cash and liquidity either today, this week, or perhaps projected over a 3-month horizon. But what are the opportunities to put that excess cash and liquidity to work? One example that I've seen, I think a lot of treasury teams do this already, certainly in the UK, is around supplier financing. So having like a reverse factoring program, which is a collaboration. It's not a treasury responsibility, but it's a shared responsibility for many organizations where treasury would identify here are pockets of liquidity, or here are objectives that we have to meet. Here are banks that we could potentially work with, and then work alongside, say, credit or procurement teams to identify which suppliers might we want to pay early, and where we actually have an opportunity to shift our working capital and maybe pay them later, but still have the suppliers paid early, is an example of a strategic initiative that many organizations have started to take on the past couple of years. That would be one of many examples. We can touch on more of them later.
Okay, well, I can't see any questions, but don't be shy. So in the meantime, I actually have a question for you, Bob, if that's okay.
Please
I find
do.
the subtitle of slide 6 quite interesting, that see, protect and grow. In today's sort of hopefully post-pandemic world, do you see companies taking on more growth projects, or are they more in that sort of protect mode? From your experience?
It's a great question. Yeah, it's a really good question. It most likely would be a balance between all three of those. And I'll show a slide in a moment that kind of talks about the progression. Typically what we see in treasury is we see this progression from productivity to visibility and then decision-making around that. And then we look at, okay, from a protection standpoint, that means how do I protect against, say, currency volatility? How do I protect against fraud? Different elements of risk management. How do I protect against maybe interest rates going up someday? Those are the sorts of scenarios where you would have those. The grow is usually the part that a lot of treasury teams don't get involved with as much, but a balance between all three is important if you want to elevate the value of the treasury team.
Thank you.
So, and we'll go into that a little bit more. I think it's a great question.
Thanks. Okay, I can't see any questions. So maybe we can move on to the second section. How can the Treasury provide value?
Sounds a great idea, Emily. Let's do that. So we'll start with, when we're talking about value, we'll start in the typical spot that most people think about. And that's, how is Treasury's time spent? How do I achieve productivity? So there's a lot of words in this slide. I'm not going to go through all of them by any means, but I'll draw your attention to the graph in the middle. If you look at this, and whether it's 3,000 hours, and by the way, if you do the math on that, it's a fairly large treasury team in terms of 3,000 hours per month spent on treasury activities. But what it's meant to show, and this is a survey that came from the Hackett Group, they looked at, in the US, they looked at Fortune 500 organizations, so sort of FTSE 500 organizations. And they came up with the fact that on average, for those that had very low levels of automation, they spent approximately 3,000 hours across the team. And that could be inclusive of finance teams that manage payments or capital markets and those sorts of capabilities. And what they found is that there was significant amounts of improvement that could be unlocked by introducing automation. Anyone that's interested, uses any sort of technology in treasury will look at that and say, well, yes, of course, that makes absolute sense. And it does. And that's why I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on this, except to look at a slide like this. So if we start with productivity, there's a lot of different statistics here. You can read through them all as I talk, but it's not, the point isn't necessarily all of the words. It's this idea of introducing an element of precision around productivity. So it's not just the fact that I saved 5 hours here or 10 hours there, or I saved a whole headcount that we were able to repurpose and suddenly take on brand new projects, but it's a level of precision that is extremely important so that you can actually get to each specific process. And in fact, I've seen scorecards and I've seen KPIs that are actually even more detailed than this. They would take, say, a daily cash positioning process and actually break that into individual pieces to identify a gain. So even what you would see on one line here would be a summary of a number of different pieces and opportunities for improvement. The point being is that the level of precision creates confidence that you can actually deliver on these objectives. It also allows you to understand specifically where the real time was saved when you're looking at this in the rearview mirror. So when you start with productivity, and I do stress start with productivity, then you're able to look at a example like this. So if you look at this particular table and infographic, you can see productivity is the very left of what we do. You know, the basic words, automation, streamlining, standardized, nice marketing words that are nice ways of describing some of the capabilities that we've introduced into the treasury team to free us up to start doing the other things. And the other things are obviously visibility, being able to have a better picture of our cash forecast, being able to take advantage of some of those opportunities where we realize, oh, we actually do have excess cash for a period of time. Let's put that to use. Let's mobilize that cash to different parts of the world. If we're a global enterprise, let's look at investing a little bit differently because we recognize we don't need this cash for working capital purposes. Identifying things like FX volatility, reducing bank fees, and some of the examples that are there. Most treasury teams are at this stage. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not opportunities for improved productivity and automation, but most treasury teams are at this level. We're doing these things, maybe not to levels of perfection, but we're certainly identifying that we're valuable in treasury. We're performing great functions. The next levels are the ones that are more difficult to reach, in part because the full productivity may not be there, and in part because the remit of treasury may not have necessarily gone to this. So then we look at things like financial risk. We look at counterparty risk, not as much an issue right now, but if you look at liquidity risk, certainly we saw that be more prominent 12 months ago when we realized we're in a situation of, okay, do we actually have enough cash and liquidity to run the organization? As an example, as the pandemic started to take hold. From a foreign exchange standpoint, a lot of treasury teams will look at their cash flows and say, are we hedged appropriately? And the answer is probably yes, or to whatever degree your policy allows. However, are we in a position where we're hedging the exposures to the balance sheet? And the answer may not be yes for a variety of reasons. One is because it may be difficult to identify what actually are the exposures, or it may not necessarily be a policy that's in place, or it might be responsibilities held by other parts of the organization. These are the sorts of things when we're thinking of how do we provide value? How do we show value of treasury? It's taking on additional responsibility around this. If you look at, say, the second set of bullet points under risk and controls, operational risk, a lot of these have to do with things like payments. And with payments, making sure that there's a shared consistency and standardization of controls. The way that we remit payments in treasury should be consistent with a payment policy that also includes accounts payable, so that all of our payments are centralized, standardized, managed in the same way, so that we are able to be in a position to have a payment audit that screens against our internal policy, but also helps us be more resilient against fraud. And so those are some of the examples that maybe are disaggregated. You might find that, well, accounts payable will do whatever they do because they're using their ERP, but we in treasury are using a whole different set of systems. So we'll do what we do and they do what they do, and we'll hope for the best. And I say that somewhat facetiously, but you get the point, is that there's a significant opportunity to ensure that your risk and control framework is standardized across all payments, regardless of what team is responsible for certain aspects of those. Those are examples of where we start to see these transformations come into play. So there's a lot of different examples there, and we can certainly touch on those if people have questions. But I do want to look at an example like this. So this is what we call a scorecard. This is just a hypothetical one. I put it together. It's not a real client example, but it's based on the kind of engagement that we would typically do with an organization to help them understand where are those opportunities for improvement. So in one like this, you can see that it's ranked by threat or risk level. And the risk level can be literally, there's a significant risk. So it could be in payments. We actually recognize that there is a way that the summer intern can create payments, approve payments, and send them out. If someone just says, oh, send this, don't tell anyone that I'm asking you, but please send this wire on an emergency basis. And again, we would recognize that very quickly in Treasury. We know what fraud and BEC scams look like. But the reality is that there may be an actual threat where we saw a breakdown or perhaps inconsistency in control. Or the threat or risk level could just be that we're leaving too much cash overnight in the bank and not actually deploying that to drive value off of that excess cash and liquidity. And so as an example, the meaning of threat or risk level might be different, but it's important to be able to prioritize and rank and identify based on what is the actual opportunity, how are we measuring that opportunity, and what is the impact to the team and ultimately to the organization, which could be the CFO's KPIs of what is that solution actually deliver. So there's a lot of words here, and I see a question coming in, so we'll address that in a second. There's a lot of words in this particular slide, and you can be as precise or numerical or as KPI focused, or just think of great descriptions to understand what is the impact of a solution, whether we're talking about cash management, whether we're talking about impacts in accounting, creating journal entries as an example, or bank relationship management as some of the examples in this slide show. But Emily, we have a quick question. I think it's a good one. So let's ask it and answer it.
Thanks for submitting this question. We see digitalization being embraced more in the past year. Do you see this trend in the treasury space, and in which particular treasury function?
I see it everywhere. Now, that said, there are areas that we see digitalization occur more. Some of those examples are payments. Payments is one that's always been a bit manual. And as I alluded to a few minutes ago, it's also one where it's disaggregated. Not every organization has a single view into all payments or disbursements that are being made in a day. That has a single view into whether there's an actual check of every single payment before it's remitted to the bank. Does this comply with our internal payment policy? Is there, and this is some treasury teams will look at sanction lists as an example, especially, even though I'm Canadian, I work in the United States quite a bit. OFAC is an example for American companies where they have to do this sort of screening before a payment goes out. These are sort of things that were manual in the past few years that are becoming more digitalized. Even on the foreign exchange side, just being able to ensure that you have things like smart contracts, which are, let's say in the next couple of years, can become very popular, that we're doing that instead of literally manually sign off on agreements. So I would say it's certainly across the spectrum, but areas like cash management, forecasting, payments are certainly ones that are ripe for digitalization, just because they're ones that have typically been the most manual in terms of collaboration and step-by-step workflows.
Thanks, Bob.
So hopefully that was a good answer. If not, ask a follow-up and we'll answer in more detail. So I'll also show a scorecard like this. Now, this is one that might be a bit more familiar to many of you because you think, okay, the previous one, I get that, but it's not necessarily the way we would represent how we are valued as an organization, the different tasks that we think are useful. This is one where there's a couple of different things that are happening here. So obviously you can see a number of different tasks. These could be very detailed. These are ones that are more spanning overall treasury responsibilities. There's examples where you might take cash and liquidity management and break that down into its own scorecard, which is very common. But if you forget what's going on the left side of the screen for a moment, let's look at the other parts because there's some interesting pieces to this. Firstly, we have performance. Hard to miss that because there's lots of colors on the right side of the screen. So you would look at how are we comparing. In many cases, this could be either to expectation, to where we would like to be able to get, so more an aspirational example, or it could be, say, monthly or quarterly performance. It really depends on how you want to use this and at what point in your project. Most cases, if you're starting to go through a digital transformation project, you're probably identifying your performance based on expectation. Here's where we are today. Here's where we would like to get to, as an example. But the other part of this diagram that's overall interesting is that this maturity level, and you can define what this looks like. In our case, what we typically do with clients is that we look at comparing against a peer group, which could be organizations within your industry or other best practice leading treasuries. So maybe ones that were presenting at that ACT conference and you think, I'd like to do what they do. That could be your peer group in terms of whom you want to be measured against around the maturity and the capability and the performance across these different areas of treasury. So there's a lot of different ways to manage a scorecard. The key aspect is identify what do I want to be measured against? How frequently do I want to do this? And what actual KPIs or what actual responsibilities do I want to identify as here's where the opportunities for improvement are, and here's the specific way that I want to be measuring. So under cash and liquidity, as an example, you may look at something such as my level of automation. And that could be where I look at ad hoc being very manual, strategic being I'm incredibly automated, so automated that it's on autopilot, and I'm actually able to focus all my time on decisioning as opposed to actually doing the work.
Shall we pause here for a few more questions if we've got anything that's come in? Okay, we've got a question from Sydney. Thanks, Sydney. How would you improve cash visibility across multiple jurisdictions, and how can you measure visibility?
Ooh, that's a great question. So there's almost two questions there, but I think they're obviously very linked. So in terms of how do you measure visibility, the first thing I would say is that you can measure visibility in two ways. One is how much cash and liquidity. I typically favor liquidity because it's cash and then what can be turned into cash. How much can I see right now? Now, I know most organizations think, okay, I look at my bank balance and I can see everything. Great. That's the easier part. The second part is how far forward do I want to be forecasting? And so it's those projections that typically make it difficult in Treasury. That's why cash forecasting is always a topic at every single ACT conference, because it's hard to do. So how do you measure visibility? I would do it in two ways. I would look at what can I see today? What am I able to see in, let's say it's a 13-week or 3-month window? And then how effective or confident am I in that visibility? So it's not just I have a forecast and it looks like this. It's how effective was that? How accurate was that over perhaps the last 3 or 6 months? And so if you're able to perform that kind of analysis, that gives you confidence that the visibility in front of you is actually reliable and you can make decisions across it. Second part of the question, how would you improve visibility across multiple jurisdictions? Well, if we're talking about actual cash right now, and you likely want connectivity to all of your different banking partners, most of you probably have that to some degree, whether it's fully automated or not. But when we get into forecasting, especially when we look at different business units and perhaps regional controllers or others that are globally around the world, that's where it becomes a little bit more difficult, and there's an opportunity for digitalization. What you probably don't want to be doing is having spreadsheets emailed to you and trying to sort that out, copy and pasting, putting that forecast together, and maybe it takes you 8 hours to do the forecast for once a week. It's probably not the efficiency and productivity that we're looking for. And so as a result, having some element of automation, but also having it as a two-way conversation, because again, visibility is only as good as what you believe its confidence level is. So if you feel, okay, that's my forecast, but I don't really trust it, I'm just going to leave a lot of money in the bank, that's not really the kind of effectiveness that we're looking for, which kind of addresses the second question, Emily, around how can treasurers' effectiveness be as a strategic partner. If you're being a good strategic partner, you're not only identifying, here's the confidence that I have, here's the numbers we can rely upon, but here's also some insight that we can offer in terms of what to do with that cash and liquidity. How do we actually make our liquidity work for us? And that could be examples of, we can return this cash to shareholders. We can actually invest this part in the business. We can actually look to invest this for a longer time horizon because we feel confident in our forecast saying, we don't need this for the next 6 months. So those would be examples in that vein of liquidity and cash management that we can become more of a business partner rather than just an operational leader.
Thanks, Bob. And thanks for sending through those great questions. Shall we move on to the final part of the presentation? How can Treasury measure their impact on the organization?
Yeah, I think that'd be a fun part, and for two reasons. One, because measuring is fun. But the second part is that we get to talk more about numbers. And if you think about it, everything we've discussed so far is more, it's words, descriptions, it's how do we want to frame ourselves, what objectives do we want to reach. All that's well and good, but what's really important is having a scorecard. And it's incredibly important. And there's a couple of slides that I'll show here. I'll go through them relatively quickly, and then we can talk, Emily, about them at the end. It's really, really critical to be able to prove that you actually are able to meet the expectations that you set out. The best way to do that is to provide quantitative support. So it's all well and good to say, well, we are a lot more efficient. We improved a lot. And I know I say it that way and it sounds, a little bit ridiculous. And that's because I'm kind of highlighting the point that the impact comes where you can say, we actually improved our cash management productivity. We actually reduced the hours spent by 88%. Or in terms of our forecasting process, we were actually able to reduce that by 75% of the time it took to prepare that weekly forecast. Now it actually takes us 1 hour instead of 4, or 4 hours instead of 16. These are the sorts of examples that really show impact rather than saying we improved a lot, we're a lot happier, and we spend a lot of time in other things. The words carry more meaning when they're supported by a number, ideally in a different color with really big font, of course. But you add this to the kind of scorecards we were talking about a moment ago, and it starts to show that you actually are able to unlock value. And it also proves that you're able to take the next step in terms of leveraging that productivity. So if you look at an example like this, and this is a sample scorecard, it's anonymized, but it's a real client example. They were able to achieve, just in cash management and forecasting, an 88% improvement. If you remember from several slides ago, I had this graph that showed 3,000 hours a month in treasury reduced by 81%. And you think, oh, that's a pretty hypothetical example. I can't see how that's possible. Well, it actually is possible. In fact, that this was an example where they had an 88% improvement across certain processes. And so that's the important part, is that if you firstly identify, here's the productivity improvement, next, here's what we're able to do with it. And in this particular example, they were able to identify that there was pockets of cash. In their case, it wasn't just in bank accounts domestically, but also in bank accounts around Europe and around the globe. And just by unlocking that cash, because they realized this is not doing anything, we're earning next to nothing sitting in bank accounts, why don't we actually put this to use in different ways? Invest it a little bit longer term, being able to look at debt repayments, being able to actually redeploy it to other parts of the organization where we could offset potential borrowing, set up a cash pool, in-house bank, all those sorts of things that can drive a return on excess cash. And so as a result, it's easy to come up with £1 million savings just by having greater efficiency. But you don't get to the bank fee savings, the return on excess cash, without having that productivity in the first place. And that's why we showed that framework before, is because if you start with productivity, that unlocks the opportunity to start looking at these projects, which are incredibly value added. So I always like to say, as I'll go to the next slide here, is that productivity doesn't actually do anything. It just frees you up to do something. And the somethings are examples like we see on this slide, where in this particular example, they had also fairly impressive productivity improvements across different aspects of Treasury. In their case, they were looking to get more resilient against fraud and eliminate payments fraud. Now, in this particular example, they'd had situations that they'd been compromised, unfortunately. And so it was easy to measure what the impact of those improved controls were. In this particular case, we actually implemented machine learning and artificial intelligence to actually drive compliance with their payment policy. But whatever the scenario is, you want to be able to capture, we feel more protected against bad actors or potentially fraudulent payment schemes than we did previously. And so that's why you see a fairly impressive number here, because it's what they had, the kind of pain and difficulty they experienced by having a fraudulent payment go out the door. If you haven't been in that situation, it's a little harder to come out with those numbers, because you're thinking, well, we haven't had fraud. We're just protecting against, we're lessening the risk of it happening to us. So you might have to come up with some more hypothetical calculations, and I can offer some guidance and Q&A on that if you have questions. But the key point is that you want to be able to quantify that in an important way so that you can say, here's where we feel our risk has been lessened. I know there's a few questions that are coming through.
Yeah,
So
should we pause for a few questions, Bob?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so first one of the challenges in most companies is to work efficiently with input data to improve treasury processes. What is best practice?
Ooh, that's a good question. I have to almost have to think about that one for a few seconds because it's actually very well phrased. So I think most organizations are challenged from a data standpoint. So the spirit of this is nothing new. If you think of words like being a data-driven treasury, or if you think of how do we use data as an enabler, then what I would say is the best way to look at that is, number one, identify what data do you need, what information do you need to make the good decision. So let's just say it's cash forecasting. What do I actually need to know in order to be confident in my cash projections? And so you take that, we'll say the end state or your top-down view, and then start to work down to figure out what information, what data points, what sources, what partners within the finance team do I need to work with to be able to identify where's that information come from. So I would always take a top-down view, but I think the spirit of the question is, if I want to become more data-centric, which I would encourage every time, how do I harness that? Part one is to find the information sources. Part two is to find a way to analyze that information. And so that's going to be using like data visualization or business intelligence. It's going to be using things like robotic process as well as artificial intelligence or machine learning, because the problem that you face when you increase the amount of data that you're looking at, Emily, is that you actually have to analyze that data. And suddenly you face a productivity issue that maybe you were thinking was behind you because I achieved all the productivity. Now I've just created a new one by suddenly having 10 times the data that I didn't even have to manage previously. So there's some double-edged sword going on there. But the key aspect, if you have the right tools to manage the data, then it's a matter of knowing what you need to find, going and get it, and then having the right way to manage and work it through.
Thanks, Bob.
So I'll stop there just because I know we're getting short on time.
Yeah, we've got another great question. If we can try to talk through that one. Defining KPIs and measuring them is possible for most treasurers, but how do I benchmark these? And how do you know how I'm doing against my external peer group? Excellent question. I actually had the same one, so I'll be keen to hear what you have to say about that.
Everyone has the same question, and partly because it's sensitive information. So there's really two ways to do this. Number one is make a lot of friends within the Treasury communities. Obviously, in person at ACT, when we're in person next year, is a lot easier. You can turn to your neighbor and say, hey, what do you think? Should we share our KPIs? Not necessarily sharing anything confidential, just general benchmarking information. And you create a peer group, or you work with, say, some of your trusted advisors. So your technology providers, your banking partners, those would be examples of whom you can work with to identify those. Obviously, not to talk about Kyriba in this presentation, but this is something that we typically do across our client base, as a banking partner would do the same across their client base, is helping you understand what those best practices look like and share how you're measuring yourself. So that's my shorter version, just because we're a little bit time compressed, Emily, but yeah, that would be the way to definitely look at that. And I'll just like it to the last slide. But yeah, look at this last slide. I won't spend a lot of time talking about this because we have just about a minute left. But this is yet another example of different ways that we can look at those KPIs and understand what does improvement look like. And these are slightly different examples than we talked about before, but they all kind of point in the same direction, is that there is an opportunity to identify even just things that are maybe not traditional treasury responsibilities, like looking at extending protection and hedging over balance sheet accounts isn't typically a treasury responsibility for many organizations as a result. And they certainly look at reducing the volatility of balance sheet changes on the earnings per share. You think, well, it's not really what Treasury does, but Treasury is starting to do things like that. So as a result, some of these examples I think are interesting. So last points I'll make before we sign off is that post-pandemic, the question was asked, digitalization. Yeah, it was forced upon us. Now it's here to stay. Part two, productivity is wonderful, but it's only as good as what you do with it. And that's what, and it matter those things that you do, those initiatives really need to be measured so that you know, and everyone knows that Treasury did amazing things. And that really is the value of a treasurer.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bob, and thank you to everyone who attended the session. Hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. Just a couple of points on the platform to remind you that visit the virtual exhibition hall to network with your peers, but also the new discussion area to exchange ideas and network further. You can replay this session or any other session that you thought you might have missed on the on-demand section, and the recordings are available for 30 days. And last but not least, it'll help the ACT extremely if you could fill out the speaker survey under the participate section as well. Thank you very much, Bob again. Thank you to everyone who's attended, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.